London's Leicester Square Theatre readies itself for the world premiere of one of the most exciting films to hit the big screen. Names like Richard Burton, Roger Moore, Richard Harris, and Hardy Kruger. The vast backdrop of Africa and a script that really is packed with action. All the ingredients for a cinematic sizzler. The Wild Geese.
Good evening, Mr. Moore fans. Have you ever heard of the term meat and potatoes movie? The first time I ever heard the term, it was from an interview with an actor who appeared in Roger Moore's North Sea Hijack. The actor describes meeting with that film's producer when first being sought for a role.
My then wife was a friend of the wife of Elliot Kastner. And so we had met socially, and he got in his head that I was going to be the Lord Privy Seal. And he said he got me, and he came to his office and said, "Hey, Jeremy, it's a meat and potatoes movie," which I never forgot, which I like very much. Meat and potatoes movie.
Well, today we're going to be talking about The Wild Geese, one of the meatiest and most potatoiest movies I have ever seen, and the meat is so rare that a half-decent vet could probably have it back chewing grass within the hour. There's just something so straight down the line, unpretentious and earthy about that description that really fits these kinds of very blokey, British-produced action movies where the smell of booze, cigarettes and gravy just seeps out of the screen and into your nostrils even all these years later. The story of The Wild Geese is relatively simple. Richard Burton plays mercenary Alan Faulkner, who is roped in by merchant banker Edward Matheson, played by Stuart Granger, to form a team to break out of prison a Julius Limbani, played by Winston Ntshona, a captured president of a southern African nation. Faulkner sets about assembling a team of 50 mercenaries, who include Roger Moore as Sean Finn, Richard Harris as Rafa Janders, and Hardy Kruger as Peter Coetzee. We see the group's formation and training, and then about halfway through the film, they actually set about on their mission. As you'd expect, there are some unforeseen complications, and the group finds itself stranded, and it must then fight its way through a hostile environment in order to escape. The plot itself probably sounds very familiar to action movie fans, and indeed, The Wild Geese does play like something of a prototype of movies like The Expendables, where it's a bunch of middle-aged mercenaries given a mission going to a foreign land, something goes wrong, and then they need to adapt. I'm reviewing the film for the channel because, of course, Roger Moore is one of the stars, he's second billed, and I'll talk about his character in a bit, but to my mind, this is a Richard Burton and Richard Harris film. Their characters have the relationship and the emotional journeys where Moore doesn't really have an awful lot to do character-wise in my mind, but more on that later. Richard Burton is obviously a legendary acting figure, and, I've seen him in a bunch of things, but primarily dramas and thrillers, so it was kind of novel for me to see him in such a big action movie part. I think he's really good in this film, but admittedly there are a few moments where you can just tell that he's hating having to do some of the more physical stuff. I don't know if he's all that convincing in some places, but overall I thought he worked really well as the lead. Anyway, his character is world-weary and cynical, he has this hard exterior and projects the idea that he has very little in the way of morals, and yet he does have a moral compass, and he cares about his teammates, most notably Richard Harris's character. In lieu of having an adult romance subplot, the film's primary source of emotional journey comes from Harris's character's relationship with his rather precocious son.
On December the 13th, you and I, in a couple of suitcases, are jumping on board an aeroplane.
Where are we going?
Wait a second. That same plane will bring us back on January the 3rd.
Skiing!
You've got it.
Switzerland!
The very thing.
Oh boy, that is fantastic!
Yes, it is.
Nice to see more work from the kid that went on Wogan in the 80s to talk about antiques. And indeed, largely, I think, because Richard Harris's character is the one with the emotional attachment back home, he was really the only member of the principal cast that I was really rooting for to escape at the end, even more than Roger Moore. I was like, no, Harris needs to get back so he can have Christmas with his son, damn it. Roger Moore, meanwhile, is coming to this film during something of a peak of his tenure as James Bond. The Wild Geese released summer 1978, sandwiched in between The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. He's playing a very different character from James Bond here, but there is a fair deal of that trademark Roger Moore charm seeping through in an awful lot of scenes that you'd expect from the actor. It's funny, I spent a good chunk of my time watching the film thinking, wow, it's weird seeing Roger Moore as the younger hero in a film. Burton, Harris, and Kruger all have these grizzled, hard-life faces that I was totally fooled into thinking they were all like 10 years or so older than Moore, but no, Moore still had access to that fountain of youth at this point in his life because all four leads were born within 5 years of each other, and Harris is actually the youngest. Fun fact, Roger Moore turned 50 during the film's production while filming in Africa, as he recalls in his autobiography. "I turned 50 during the production, and to mark it, the cast and crew organised a huge surprise for me, miles out into the bush where they lit 6 huge braais, barbecues around 10 feet high. I was rather sensitive about turning 50, preferring to stay 49 forever, but it made headlines all around the world, so there was very little chance of me avoiding it." While I'm here, I just want to recall another story from Moore's autobiography about filming The Wild Geese. If you know anything about Roger Moore, you'll know that on set, he was quite the prankster, and this is an instance where Richard Harris tried to turn the tables on Roger Moore himself. "I knew Harris was up to something one evening. I returned to my house and could hear a lot of giggling between him and his wife Anne. I looked around and at the foot of my bed lay a snake, a rubber one. I pulled the sheets off the bed and there lay a tarantula. Again, rubber. Aha, Harris is up for some fun, I thought. I didn't scream or react in any way whatsoever, which must have annoyed him to no end. However, there were loud screams the next night from the Harris household as he went to put on his boots and discovered snakes in them. Real snakes. The moral of this story? Don't around with Moore. Moore's character has less to do dramatically than either Harris or Burton, and this was seemingly by the actor's own request. I read online that Moore actually requested his number of lines be cut so that he didn't feel like he had to try and outperform his fellow leads. Probably his character's most memorable moment is the scene that introduces him, where he's confronting a drug dealer and forces him at gunpoint to eat a block of cocaine, which is just this very amusing moment. It's such a ridiculous bit, but it's played so dramatically and straight that it's just sort of, yeah, it's hilarious.
Now eat. Now do it! Do it! All of it. Come on, pour it down.
It is, I think, though, the most memorable part of the film. I've seen The Wild Geese once before, and it was about 10 years ago, and I don't know if I could have told you much about what happens in this film, other than Roger Moore forces a man to eat cocaine. Indeed, the character is a good deal colder than Moore's typical Bond persona, and it's interesting to hear him talking about this scene specifically in the film's audio commentary in relation to the fact that he actually tried to pull back on some of the colder kill moments that the Bond scripts would occasionally try to give him.
And if we could, Roger, talk about the scene where you make the coke, or the mafia guy, eat his heroin. That was one of those scenes I always wondered might have sort of cut against the grain. There was a scene in John's first film as director, For Your Eyes Only, where you had to kick a car off a cliff that I understand you weren't desperately happy with.
Well, no, in the film you're talking about, the Bond film, with kicking the car, I just thought that was just one little bit too far for me as Bond, but it was right for the film. But I had no qualms whatsoever about shoving coke up an actor's nose. Not an actor's nose, but up a dealer's nose, because they're the most evil bastards in the world, and they deserve to be killed that way.
By the way, just while we're on a Bondian train of thought here, I just want to point out there are a couple of screams in this soundtrack that I think Bond fans will be quite familiar with. It's kind of an underrated British Wilhelm scream, I guess. And as you'd expect from a British film of this era, there's indeed a good deal of Bond DNA running through the whole thing. John Glenn, probably most notably, is the editor and second unit director. He would, of course, go on to direct Roger Moore in his last 3 Bond films, and there's a bunch of crew here that worked on various 007s. Valerie Leon pops up in a small part for the Bond girl spotters. And, funnily enough, similar to some other films that I reviewed Bond actors in on the channel, the film deals a little with the politics of South Africa. Seriously, between this, Roger Moore's Gold, and George Lazenby's Universal Soldier, I could start a new playlist on the channel of Bond actors in movies dealing with South African politics. In this film, though, the scenes most explicitly I don't even want to say exploring or dealing with, because I don't feel like the film is really trying to be about this, but there are some scenes between Kruger and Nachona's characters where they talk about the state of South Africa and touch on racial politics. This contributes to something of a small character arc for Kruger that plays out through some of these middle scenes, and I guess that being a British-made film in Africa in the 1970s, they needed to touch on this, or they felt like they needed to touch on this, but I don't feel like The Wild Geese is really the film to be making statements about real-world politics, and it sounds like John Glenn and Roger Moore agree with me if their comments relating to this topic in the commentary are anything to go by.
We had a few arguments about the scene, if I remember rightly. Yeah.
Well, we did.
We came to a compromise at the end, I think.
Yes, yes. I think you cut it brilliantly. I mean, and I didn't want to lose anything, but you did take out certain.
Yes.
It was too long.
It was too long, and you know, it's the trouble with any scene where you tend to lecture the audience. You're on dangerous ground.
Oh, exactly.
So that's what my concern was, and we had endless conversations and arguments about it, but we did, I think, came to the right decision.
Yes, yeah. But political feelings being as they are, politics are best left out of movies, as John just said. But now and again, if you have something to say, you should say it. Had I made the film, for example, it was quite impossible to do so, but had I produced the film in Russia or an Eastern Bloc country, there would have been absolutely no objection from anyone. Such is the divide.
Louis B. Mayer said, Western Union is for sending messages.
Quite so.
I know that The Wild Geese has its fans, and I can see why, but for me personally, I found it just a little bit too by the numbers and lacking enough action to justify the more than 2 hours running time. It's almost procedural in places with the amount of time it spends on the setup and the training that the geese have to go through. Once things move to Africa and the action gets going, I have to admit I do become a bit more entertained. That being said, I am someone who can watch any old thing involving Roger Moore or Richard Burton and just take joy in their on-screen presences, and indeed, that is what kept me going through most of the first hour of this thing. One of the highlights for me, though, in terms of the action was the whole parachute sequence. I just love this shot in particular of all of the geese just pouring out of the back of this plane. It's such a brilliant shot, and seeing so many people in freefall together and so close is incredible. It gets a little synchronized skydiving at a point, though, where the gang are all going into their formations, and I'm not sure that a team of 50 mercenaries would really take this opportunity to show off their aerobatics, but okay, it's a nice scene, whatever. Another highlight for me is the geese infiltrating the prison to spring at the captured president. There's a fantastically suspenseful sequence involving Kruger and his crossbow taking out the guard tower watchman, which had me in a chokehold. I really didn't know which way this thing was going to go. I thought it was a really well-constructed suspense set piece. I think the film looks great when it's out on location in Africa and there are some nice shots, but damn, does the set-based stuff look really awful. I mean, it's just so overlit and flat. It looks like a TV production in places, which is a bit of a shame. And I also found the score quite grating. It's a very good time adventure kind of score containing some rousing marching tunes, which I felt really jarred with some of the more melancholy action in places. I was surprised to see that I've actually reviewed this director's work before with North Sea Hijack, also starring Roger Moore, and yeah, I think that my feelings are much the same for this film as they were for that film. There's enough going on with the personalities on screen that I'm happy enough to sit through the thing, but ultimately there wasn't a lot here keeping me super hooked regarding the story and or the action. The Wild Geese has been a much requested film for me to make a video about on this channel, so I know that the thing has its fans, and yeah, I had a good enough time watching it. It is a real meat and potatoes movie, I think. It's just not a film that moved the dial for me all that much, but hey, it has 4 great leads and Roger Moore forcing a man to eat a block of cocaine at gunpoint, so it's well worth watching for that alone. Let me know your thoughts on The Wild Geese in the comments section below. Also below, you can click the subscribe button and the Mrs. Bell notification button to stay super up to date on future video uploads, and if you would like to have a say in deciding which non-Bond movie review I look at next, then do consider heading over to my Patreon page. There's a link below, as well as links to my various other social media pages, so please do follow me on those if you care to do so. And with all that being said, and until next time, Mr. Moore fans, so long for now.